Geeks and geekettes, it's Wednesday morning. Speaking to you from a soon-to-be hurricane-ravaged Central Florida, it's Chuck Dixon here again to answer your questions about what it is I do for a living. And what I do for a living is I write comic books, strange as that may seem. I want to thank all of you for the great questions this week and watching and listening and everything else. And if I might bother you for just a second before our proceedings begin, think about going over to Subscribe Star Chuck Dixon. The link will be just below this video. There's a $1 tier, there's a $5 tier. Both offer you digital goodies, but the $5 tier, you'll get the occasional physical media goodie, signed comics, limited edition postcards, things like that. Bottom line, collectibles as my way of saying thank you for subscribing. These subscriptions help me, quite frankly, it's a slush fund that helps me finance comic projects, helps me finance making these videos, and a lot of different things. Just help out and give me an attaboy. So follow the link below and help out if you can. If not, well, thank you anyway. Thanks for watching. Alan Barebi. Chuck Dixon, one of my favorite side characters of yours was Clancy, especially drawn by Greg Land. I know you're a huge Scott McDaniel fan, but I preferred Land's art. Anyway, did you have plans for her, or were they derailed because of the Birds of Prey reuniting Dick and Barbara? Sip of tea first. Yeah, Clancy, Bridget Clancy was a character I created for Nightwing, and mostly she was just created as not necessarily a serious romantic interest, but just a female that Dick Grayson would be interested in when he moved to Bloodhaven. He's new in town, doesn't know anybody, and Clancy was his landlord. She rented him his apartment, his very humble apartment, and she was initially created as a one-time gag or extended running joke gag, because for the first few issues of Nightwing, we didn't see Clancy's face. I came up with different reasons why when Dick meets her, he doesn't get to meet her face to face, so we don't see what she looks like. But we do establish that she has a rather enchanting Irish brogue. And then when he finally does meet her in person, there's a meet cute when he discovers that she's actually of Chinese descent, but raised in Londonderry. I got that idea from I was listening to TV one day while doing something else, and they were interviewing some people in Ireland, and they were interviewing these two girls with an Irish brogue, and I looked up to see what they looked like, and they were both Chinese. And I thought, whoa, I'm going to use that in a story somewhere. And thus, Bridget Clancy was born. I never meant her as a serious long-term love interest for Dick Grayson. The reuniting or rekindled or whatever romance between Dick Grayson and Barbara Gordon was my idea. And I kind of had it in mind all along and was building up to it. But, Dick Grayson being a red-blooded American boy, he's going to be, interested in girls. And I just wanted to introduce a female character that was basically not a love interest, but just someone he was attracted to and someone he could interact with. And I thought the gag was clever. And that's the reason why the character was introduced. So, and also I was building a supporting cast for Nightwing's first monthly book, because you needed a supporting cast. And that's where Bridget came from. Timothy Buckley. What are writers' fears of using Robin in a Batman series for whatever media it's produced for? For decades, I always hear writers say they want to take Batman back to his roots, but his roots only lasted 9 issues in Detective. It looks like Looks like your computer picked a word for you. I also something Robin was created to be like Watson to Batman's Holmes, where the character was used to explain plot points. Also, why is the Batman TV show still used as a reason or excuse to make Batman darker, obsessive, paranoid, and almost borderline psychotic? Well, yeah, I mean, well, Watson wasn't really created for Sherlock Holmes, basically to explain plot points. I mean, Watson tells the stories. Watson is our entree into Sherlock Holmes's world. If you were to introduce Sherlock Holmes cold to the reader from a third person omniscient perspective, it would have seemed hokey or silly. But us seeing him through Watson's eyes and learning about Holmes through Watson's eyes was a key element to engaging us in the character, and a very wise choice by Arthur Conan Doyle. I'd also like to say that Watson was a rich character of his own, and if you read the stories, Conan Doyle has a lot of fun playing with the Watson character from a lot of different perspectives. And there's a lot of commentary on the art of writing, sort of hidden in the Holmes stories. In some of the later Holmes stories, Holmes tells the stories himself and acknowledges that he never fully appreciated Watson's talents in telling these stories. There's a lot of playfulness on Doyle's part, which is why the stories are still so much fun to read today. The original Sherlock Holmes stories still seem fresh, even today. Conan Doyle was an amazing talent, and pretty much created the modern detective genre. Anyway, I'm off on a tangent. Robin is important to Batman because he's a humanizing element. It also gives Batman someone to talk to, and trust me, whenever they treat Batman as the lone psychotic, crazed, obsessed character, it doesn't sell well. I mean, fans say they love it, but then they don't buy it. And we can kind of see from the collapsing sales today as they make Batman darker and darker and darker. And on the subject of darkness, where's the end? Where's the end? You keep going dark and trying to top the last dark thing you did, you're going in a bad direction. And as evidenced by what we see in comics over the last few decades. But to your point, it was Denny O'Neil who told me why Robin was important when he wanted me to write the first Robin miniseries. And I was doubtful. I was like, dude, do you really need Robin? Yeah, I was working hard to get that job. I just wanted to do a right job. I didn't want to just take the job. Oh, it's a Batman job. I'm going to make lots of money, blah, 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 blah. No, I wanted to make sure that I understood what they expected, and was I the right guy for the job? Did I care enough about Robin to write about it, write about the character? And then he explained, that it's a triumvirate. It's Batman, it's Robin, it's Alfred. Robin and Alfred humanize Bruce Wayne, so that he's relatable, and that made all the sense in the world. The irony is that you mentioned the '66 television show and how everything is a reaction to it. Denny hated the 1966 television show, and pretty much every effort Denny made was to reboot Batman from that campy, old chum image that he had from the Adam West Burt Ward's show. And, I shared his disdain for that show when I was a kid, because I thought, this isn't Batman. I remember my parents laughing at the show, which is like, you're not supposed to laugh at Batman. Batman's serious. So, but as I grew older, I began to appreciate the show more, particularly what the writers did as far as establishing the villains' personalities and things. There are a lot of villains represented on the show that had been in the comics before, but they weren't very fleshed out. And the show did that because they had to for a television show. They had to bring more depth to characters like Catwoman and the Riddler And they did. And all of those things influenced the comics, whether Denny liked that or not. So I would stay away from anything related to the television show. I did ask once if why can't we use King Tut, because I thought he was a cool villain. And the bookworm. I wanted to use the bookworm, but then he was no, nothing from the television show. But I did sneak in references every once in a while. I snuck a few past Denny, like naming one of the bridges in Gotham the Westward Bridge, so it's named after Adam West and Burt Ward, and I did put a reference to a bat turn into a story, but they all flew past Denny without him realizing it. But, like I said, the irony was that, Denny was the guy who initially moved Batman back toward his darker, earlier image, but understood the reasons why Robin was necessary to the series. Because at the end, Denny wanted the books to sell well. And he had seen the sales trends whenever they went darker, whenever they went meaner, whenever they turned Batman into a loner. The sales fell. Maybe diehard comic fans wanted loner Batman, but loner Travis Bickle Batman, but casual readers wanted the dynamic duo. And so there you go. That is the story. And hey, it's a Tim twin spin. Okay, Mr. Buckley, you get another shot. Comic book writing is different from most other writing as it is constantly ongoing. How do you fit the writing process, exposition, rising action, climax, into a narrative that has no definitive end? Also, if you take an ongoing writing assignment, do you try to continue with the previous writer's direction, or do you create a new interpretation from the very beginning? Well, comics were... I remember at an early Batman summit, Denny said that, Paul Levitz was talking about when he was running his summits, introduced the idea of the ABC plotting, which is used in soap operas. ABC plotting is you always have a plot A, which is beginning, a plot B, which is continuing, and a plot C, which is ending. And so you have three storylines, all in various stages of development. You have a story beginning, you have a story that's been carried on from before, and then you have a longer story that was carried on from before, is now coming to a conclusion. And so there's always this, even though this is, these are ongoing titles running years and years and years and years, and storylines that run for months and months and months. You want to give the readers a sense of closure every once in a while. And also you want to introduce new beginnings to the reader. But the thing is, once you introduce a subplot, an A, B, or C plot or subplot, you have to conclude it. It has to be going somewhere. It has to have a definitive end. And we utilized a lot of that when we were working on Batman. And that's how you keep the material fresh, because it's not just the same old thing. Every issue, you're introducing new characters, new situations, new plots, new threats, new suspense elements, or new humor elements, or whatever. But then you're paying them off, so the reader feels like they've accomplished something by reading this, and that things are actually moving forward in a story. Now, as far as taking over a title that's already established, a lot of writers will just throw the baby out with the bathwater and just immediately establish their own feel, their own take, their own characters. They'll snip off subplots like dangling threads and start anew. I've never been that way, because I figure if I'm taking on an established book, it's established for a reason. It's because readers have been reading it. That's why it's still around. And I kind of want to, not even kind of want to, I definitely want to make sure that those readers aren't, jarred by a new writer taking over. And so I will pay heed to what the writer before me did. I will utilize his characters and subplots and everything else, and then sort of weave them into my own. And I'm going to weave them into my own, not just because it's an ego thing or I want to make this book mine, but because I got to come up with my own ideas now. And I'm going to sort of intermesh what came before into the new storylines. And also, I'm going to pay off the previous writers' storylines and subplots and pay off characters, have things come to a conclusion. And, eventually, after a few issues, the book is all me. But I don't start out all me because I don't think that's fair to the reader. Because not every reader looks at the writer's credits. They just want to read about, Captain Potato Salad, what's going to happen next. And is he going to be able to get out of that trap, or whatever, or is his girlfriend ever going to come back? And so I have to deal with all those things because that's my job as a comic book writer, taking over from someone else. And I'm not going to drastically change characters or alter things or in any way, piss on what came before, because, when you diss the previous writer's work, you're dissing the readers too, because they liked it. They bought it. And I feel like I owe something to that guy for for setting everything up. Billy Calabrese. I remember on a previous episode you mentioned that DC had rules at the time about the Batman offices not being able to use Titans characters. So I was wondering, is that why you never wrote the original Batgirl Betty Kane, or as she was referred to post-crisis in only a handful of appearances, Flamebird? Also thought there was potential for this character and would love to know what your take would be, just your general thoughts on the character. Thanks again for decades of phenomenal work. Well, I'm going to tell you, my thoughts on the character were I completely forgot she existed. I remember reading Batwoman and Batgirl stories back when I was a kid, but I completely forgot about this character. And I had to go back and take a look. But yeah, I never really thought about the original Batgirl. I completely forgotten there was a Batgirl. I mean, as is well known now, Barbara Gordon was created by the television people. They wanted a Batgirl. And so DC hurried up and introduced a Batgirl into the titles. And if you read Barbara Gordon's origin story, it's a rush job. It really is. There's not a lot of, it's under dramatized to say the least, because they had to get it into production. They had to get that comic book out shortly before the appearance of the character in the series. But as far as Batwoman, the original Batwoman, Kathy Kane, I did have plans for her. My buddy Clint McElroy, who's a big-time radio personality and podcaster now, he had the idea that he would leave his high-paying radio job and become a full-time comic book writer. Thankfully, that didn't work out for him. but he and I had proposed the Legends of the Dark Knight arc that had Batwoman in it, and we would reintroduce Batwoman to the DCU in a brand new way. And what it was Kathy was a late night horror movie show host, and she took on the persona of Batwoman because of this urban legend about this Batman fighting crime in the dead of night. So she takes on this persona, and she dresses in a costume very much like Batman's, and she introduces horror movies. Well, the problem is, I can't remember which villain, but one of the Batman villains becomes fixated on her and acts as if, she's somehow actually connected to the real Batman, and begins to go after her, and thus this sort of faux showbiz Batwoman character encounters the real Batman and Robin, and adventure and hijinks ensue. And we only meant it for an arc. We didn't mean to reintroduce this version of Batwoman on any serious permanent basis. We just thought it would make for a fun arc, but it never went any further than that. We proposed it, and I think Archie Goodwin was the editor at the time. He liked our pitch, but I think the folks upstairs did not want to see this character reintroduced. And I can kind of see why, because once we bring her back into the fold, then other writers were going to want to use her, and perhaps the powers that be at DC prefer that this version of Batwoman remain in the past. Ivan Magila, have you ever declined any requests for adaptation because you thought the final product would not be as your concept? Would you decline a good proposal for that reason? What IP of yours would you most like to see adapted to each format, movie, live action, series, animation? I particularly would like to see an animation of My Sister Suprema, which I imagine would be very funny. Yeah, I mean, I did some adaptation work I probably wasn't that interested in. I mean, I did my best work on it. But I did some stuff that, I didn't particularly admire. Admire the literary quality of, but it was a job at the time when I wasn't getting a lot of work. These days I can turn work down more readily if I'm not interested. I only work in things that I'm really, really interested in now, but back then it was a job, and you got to pay the mortgage. So, but I can't think of an adaptation job I've ever turned down. I probably would turn down one now if I didn't want to do the work, if I didn't appreciate the source material. But I can't think of one I turned down. As far as what would I like to see adapted, I would love to see the Bad Times books as a streaming series. Military adventure, time travel stuff, if you've never read them. A bunch of U.S. Army Rangers get involved in a time travel project and go back in the past to ancient Rome, the Franco-Prussian War, the Taiping Rebellion, prehistoric Nevada, all kinds of places and different alternate universes. And it's a big old shoot 'em up. Yes, in the final book, they do encounter dinosaurs. Because, how can you write a time travel thing and not have any dinosaurs in it? It's against the law. So, I like to see these as a live action. And I have, I've had producers approach me and there's been talks, but that stuff generally never goes anywhere. But there has been quote unquote interest, as they say. Now I agree with you. I'd love to see My Sister Suprema, but I'd like to see live action as opposed to animated. I'd like to see some actual actors in the roles. And My Sister Suprema, in case you're not following it, is a weekly series by me and Anthony Gonzalez Clark. You can read it for free at Arctoons, and it's going over like gangbusters over there. People really like My Sister Suprema. If you don't know what My Sister Suprema is, it's a sibling rivalry comedy where a young kid, Randy, creates a superhero experiment he finds on a website in order to turn himself into a superhero, but inadvertently the experiment gets used on his older sister Cecilia, who becomes Suprema, and she has no interest in being a superhero whatsoever. So it's a like I said, it's a sibling rivalry comedy, and it's also a parody on the superhero genre. And people are digging it, and a lot of the reason for that is Anthony Gonzalez's Clark's artwork is just amazing. He takes scenes that might have made someone smile that I wrote and gets full out belly laugh, because he makes everything that I write so much better and so much funnier. And you really need to check it out. Like I said, it's free at Arctoons. There'll be a link following underneath this video, and you just run over there and check it out. I assure you, you will find it amusing. Dan Donovan, I loved your examination of Steranko's art in your latest Ask Chuck Dixon. Is there any creator who had a bigger influence on comics with a smaller body of work than Steranko? He and Neil Adams revolutionized art in the late 60s, but even though Adams's body of work is comparatively small, it dwarfs Steranko's. I can't tell you what a big influence Steranko was, the huge impact he had on comics. And one of the reasons is because, at that time, I think I was in junior high when Steranko shows up on Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. And at that time, all the guys drawing comics were my dad's age. I mean, every guy drawing comics, there were no young people drawing comics. They were all guys who were from the golden age, guys who had been in the business for 20 years or more, still drawing comics and still doing great work. I mean, obviously, digging Wally Wood and Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko and, Joe Kubert and all those guys just doing awesome stuff, but there was no new blood. And Neil Adams came along with this sort of, different look, more realistic look to the work. And that had a lot of impact. And then, but Steranko's just came on like gangbusters. And it was his love of comics and his keen understanding that comics are an immediate experience. Comics are something that need to delight, thrill, and amaze in every panel. Every image has to be a knockout. And his, depth of knowledge about the history of comics and appreciation of the medium, it was in everything he did. I mean, these were in your face, amps turned up to 11 comics. Never slowed down, always trying to engage you, always drawing you in, just amazing imagery and, just rock'em sock'em stuff. He takes Kirby like to another level and attention to detail and just the artistry of it. This guy obviously had a deep, deep love of the medium, a deep love of these characters, and it shows. And the coolest thing about it was he was a young guy, and Marvel let you know, and they Stan promoted Jim as, this, new young Turk coming in here. Hey kids, somebody not a whole lot older than you is drawing comics. And I think that opened the door to the next wave, which came a few years later, Bernie Wrightson and Mike Kaluta and Barry Smith and guys like that. But it really begins with Steranko. And I think to a lot of guys, me included, seeing Steranko, seeing a new face after all this time, doing comics, who was a relatively young guy, made me think, hey, I could do that. And I'm probably not the only guy who thought that way. And thus you had this new generation of talent show up in the early 70s. But, everything about Steranko was dynamic and huge and game changing because, he played with storytelling, he played with composition, he played with character, and he did comics that were generally more sophisticated. And I don't mean artsy fartsy pretentious. They just were, he was lifting the medium up, taking the super without changing anything. He didn't do anything drastic or radical or dark or dismal or anything else. He just took these characters to what he thought was the next level as far as craft, storytelling, character development, things like that. And just a more mature work, which was different at Marvel because Marvel, understand, was, a little hokey jokey, a little tongue in cheek, a little self-effacing, a little self-aware. And none of Steranko's work was like that. Steranko was just full bore, in your face, hyper dramatic comics. And as a kid, I responded big time. I just, like I say, it's you cannot overestimate his impact on comics at the time. Andrew Schweitzer. Hi, Mr. Dixon. I remember an interview with Steven Spielberg where he said that Spielberg bait. You people keep baiting me with Spielberg, and I'm going to rise to it. I'm going to take the hook. He said the two movies he would want to be remembered for more than others are Schindler's List and E.T. the Extraterrestrial. My question is, are there any story arcs for specific issues you would like to be truly remembered for? Yeah, okay. You got me. You got me. E.T. You want to be remembered for E.T.? Who's watched this movie? Has anyone watched this movie in 20 years? I mean, every time they have a new vaunted anniversary re-release or new Blu-ray, new DVD, new videotape, new whatever, they end up filling landfills with them because nobody wants them. This is a movie that is best seen in the rearview mirror. It was fun at the time, but looking back on it, it's the most schmaltzy, sentimental, manipulative thing that Spielberg ever made. Of course, it's one of his favorite movies. He made a fortune. He's probably thinking about the houses he bought off of this movie. But it's not a movie that's aged well. And it particularly hasn't aged well because though it's one of his favorite movies, Spielberg can't seem to resist going back and tinkering with it and changing things. But yeah, it's one of those movies, see it and forget it. But because of the PR machine, we're told it's one of the most marvelous, most beloved movies of all time. Yeah, and Tom Hanks was so convincing as Walt Disney. uh, you know, it's yeah, what can I say? And Schindler's List, I have a problem with because every time Spielberg attacks serious material, quote unquote serious material, he feels that he's going to be the last word on it. And so he's going to tell the whole world about the Holocaust in a way that they've never understood it before. And what I object to is, is the best place to be educated about the Holocaust at your local multiplex. It's not as if there weren't like lots of documentaries. There weren't lots of books written about it. It's, of course he's going to say it's his favorite movie because, he won Academy Awards and all the rest of it. And it's seen as his most serious film. But is it his best movie? No, it's not his best movie. His best movie is Raiders of the Lost Ark. And it always will be. And even Spielberg himself admits that he worked harder on Raiders of the Lost Ark than any other film he's ever worked on. And I've talked about this before on the videos, and I've heard from people who've worked with Spielberg as part of crew and everything else. They all will remain nameless. And they said that everything I said about Spielberg was right. That he's one of the laziest directors in the world. Now, he worked hard on Raiders of the Lost Ark for one and only reason, because he was in a severe career slump. He was fresh off of 1941, a movie which nearly bankrupted two studios, Columbia and Universal, who had teamed to make this, gigantic turkey. And it was an epic money loser. And no one wanted to hire him. No one wanted to touch him. He was finished. And his film school pal, George Lucas, hired him to do Raiders of the Lost Ark. And Spielberg realized, if this movie's not a hit, I'm finished. I'm through. So he worked like a Trojan on this movie. He was there every day, which apparently is unusual for Spielberg to actually be there every day of shooting. I've heard stories from crew members and stuff that he was, he would direct movies over the phone from vacation. He'd be vacationing in Hawaii or something. And direct the movie over the phone. But this movie, he was hands-on all the way. And it shows. I mean, he's not untalented. But even the talented people have to work hard. You got to put some sweat in. And Raiders of the Lost Ark is a perfect adventure film. It is flawless. There is nothing wrong with this movie. And everything from the cinematography to the action to the actors is absolutely flawless. And if you want a comparison, watch any of the Indiana Jones sequels. They all suck. They sucked. Everything that is right with Raiders of the Lost Ark is wrong with all of the sequels. Here we have, I don't want to get into Raiders, but anyway, you brought up Spielberg and I'm blaming you. Now, as far as arcs I'm proud of or whatever, or works I'm proud, I've written thousands of comics. I'm proud of all of them. So I'm just going to pick a few at random. The Nom issue number 66 is sympathy. The Nom issue 66 is, the best thing I've ever written. It was a standalone issue. I wrote it in one sitting. I sat down and wrote all 22 pages. It just came out of me. Inspired by God. I don't know what happened, but the story came to me all at once one morning. I just sat down that day and wrote it. And to this day, I still think it's the best thing I've ever written. And Last Laugh, the Last Laugh crossover, created by me and Scott Beatty, I'm really proud of, because it's the first full cross-company crossover that I, was directing along with Scott. And we had lots of meetings and lots of all the rest of it, all of the stuff, and writing, Bibles and pitches and outlines. All the stuff is involved in the crossover, and I think it turned out very well. I think the actual core mini series that it all surrounds, and then a lot of the stories that were inspired by it, because that the month that it came out, it was released weekly. The month that it came out, all of the titles used the Last Laugh gag of a jokerized villain, which was the gag of Last Laugh. Joker manages to jokerize all the villains in a maximum security supervillain lockup, and chaos ensues. But I really dug it, and I know Scott is proud of it as well. It's never been fully collected here in this country. It's been partially collected. It's weird. There's a trade paperback that's simply not complete. It doesn't have the first issue in it for some inexplicable reason. But overseas, it's never out of print in Germany, Spain, Italy, France. Very, very popular worldwide. And actually, it's very, very popular here. It sold very, very well. I think it deserves a better reputation than it has. Another arc or run that I'm really proud of is when Gary Quapis and I teamed on Punisher War Journal. And, it was me and Gary. Gary's my most frequent comic book collaborator. We have the longest relationship, continuing relationship in comics. And we're working up until very recently on the weekly Pellucidar strip. But here we were kind of like unleashed. And the result was, I don't know, kinetic. Because we had come off a long run on Savage Sword of Conan together, and we just kind of went wild on Punisher War Journal. Just really, really gonzo action. And Don Daly, who was our editor at the time, encouraged us to go more and more gonzo. And I don't know, it's just so much fun coming up with crazy ideas for Gary to draw. And then Gary, of course, bringing it 150%. These stories are seriously nuts. Probably, except for stuff I've written for Flynn Henry, this is probably the zaniest comic book stories I've ever written. I particularly like the hillbilly drug gang who move into the city, and the result at one of the end of the arcs is Punisher getting his own exoskeleton armor a la Iron Man, but of course he's doing it on a Frank Castle budget, so it doesn't quite work right. I just love everything about what Gary and I did. And hey, this poster sent in a lovely picture of Cody and Chip, his dog and kitty. So I thought you'd all appreciate that as well. Hey, what you reading? People seem to like this segment. And I've actually been reading quite a bit lately. One of the things I really enjoyed recently was these 2 new volumes from Cinebooks of Lucky Luke. And they're more recently done within the last couple of years. And they're sort of a reboot or a reimagining of Lucky Luke as a more dramatic in tone. And the artist doesn't really change anything. Everything is the same about Lucky Luke, except his horse doesn't talk, and it's not as much a Western parody as it is a Western pastiche. And I've really enjoyed both volumes so far, and I hope this guy continues. I hope these are successful, because they were really solid, really good Western adventure stories. Good shoot 'em ups. The humor is still there. The tone is still there. He changes really nothing about Lucky Luke. It has the same tone, the same feel, and they're still like PG rated Western adventures, which I also liked. He doesn't go darker. He resists all those things, and I find that's true whenever they reboot stuff in Europe. They seem to have an affection, and they seem to honor the source material more than creators here do, and they don't seek to replace it or alter it beyond all recognition. So, I mean, if you like Lucky Luke by Morris and others, if you like classy Lucky Luke, I assure you will like these. In fact, they sort of have the feel of a Universal International Western, which I know are really popular in France. In fact, if you want to find Universal International Westerns, a lot of them on DVD, the only place you can find them is in France. So, kind of, dramatic, but not too heavy. Emphasis on gunplay and suspense and romance and all the rest of it. These Lucky Luke volumes have it all. I highly recommend them, especially since they're now in English from Cinebooks. Another one I've been reading is the Vinland Saga. Man, I've been binging this one. I'm getting near the end. I'm getting to volume 12, which is the last volume until December, here available in the United States. Vinland Saga is by Makoto Yukimura. It's a manga about the Vikings. I've talked about it before, but just recently I read 5 volumes in a row because I just wanted to see what happens next. And you wouldn't think that the Viking era would be good subject matter for a manga, or that you could trust that it would be accurate, or maybe the excesses of the manga format would override the material, but it doesn't. This is as accurate a Viking story as you're going to get anywhere. And I'm really, really enjoying it. And it is bloodthirsty fun. But as the series goes on, you get more and more involved with each of the characters, and they're very sharply and indelibly drawn, and very consistently portrayed. And you've got the rich eye candy of the story, and combined with these terrific character arcs and humor moments. I mean, this one's got it all. I highly recommend Vinland Sagas. But man, I just caution you, once you start them, you're going to be hooked, because it's just awesome stuff. I read a book on Edson's Raiders. I was listening to the Jesse Kelly radio show, and he said, you need to know about Edson's Raiders. And I thought, well, he's a former Marine, and he reads a lot of history, so I thought I'd check it out. So I read this book about Merritt Red Mike Edson, who in the early days of World War II, when America was very frustrated after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and the American public wanted to see something done about it, so in some way, how were we going to strike back against Imperial Japan? But of course, the United States was years from any kind of serious assault on the Japanese home islands. So it was suggested by Franklin Delano Roosevelt's son that a commando unit be formed in the United States Marine Corps. Well, the Marines were like, well, the British are commandos. We're not going to copy anybody. We're Marines. We're not commandos. And Marines have always been a first responder, first to fight. They've always been, in the battle before anybody else. So we're not going to call ourselves commandos. So they came up with the almost piratical term of raiders, and they were going to be the Marine Raiders. And Merritt Edson was tasked with forming the unit, who in the early days of World War II at Guadalcanal and islands surrounding it, basically gave the Japanese hell, and suffered incredible casualty rates in defense, particularly of Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. The Japanese very much wanted to take that airfield, and Edson's Raiders were the main reason why they didn't. These guys were always outnumbered, always up against it, and I jumped ahead. And just amazing stories. Lots of Congressional Medal of Honors, most of them awarded posthumously. And reading this book was torture because of the physical deprivations these guys went through, the horrible wounds, the casualty losses, all the friends they lost, and everything else. But early days of World War II, these guys were the point of the spear, and they were a lot of times completely alone, and as they say, outnumbered against a formidable foe, the Japanese army, and won out in the end and earned their place in history. Also just finished The Emperor's Colored Coat, second in a series of books by John Biggins about the Austrian-Hungarian Navy in the early part of the 20th century. And the Biggins is, wow, this guy does, I hats off to this guy. He writes about an area and a period that I'm not familiar with, and his research is exhaustive. Throws so many ideas, so many concepts, so many historical facts at you in the run of this novel. The novels are told from first person by a Austro-Hungarian naval officer named Ottokar Prohaska. And there's humor, adventure, action, all the rest of it. This one deals with the months before World War I, when Ottokar becomes involved inadvertently in the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, and then ends up in China when World War I is declared, and basically has to fight his way on a Chinese junk with torpedoes mounted on it. He has to fight his way out of the South China Sea, and eventually ends up in Arabia, trying to basically get home to Austria. And it's just fun historical adventure stuff, and I highly recommend it for anybody who's really, really geeky about history, because just amazing stuff is related. Amazing real historical facts are related in the midst of a rousing, ripping yarn. Another book I read recently in one sitting was Hostage for a Hood. I recently learned, you learn something new every day. I recently learned this guy, Lionel White, he wrote the novel that the movie The Killing was based on. If you've ever seen The Killing, you should. It's an early Stanley Kubrick film. Sterling Hayden leads a gang of misfits in robbing a racetrack, a horse racetrack, and they cause a distraction by shooting the lead horse with a sniper's rifle. It's a crazy movie. It's a great movie. One of the best heist movies ever made. And I read a review on one of the Facebook pages, many Facebook pages that I read about, men's adventure and mystery and vintage paperbacks. And a guy was saying that, Lionel White was this master of the heist novel. And he wrote like 35 heist novels for gold medal paperbacks. And gold medal paperbacks were terrific. Terrific stuff back in the 50s, early 60s. So I looked it up, and wow, they were all reprinted in new editions today that were affordable. So I didn't have to pay collector prices. And I sat down to read the first one I got the other day, and I didn't get up. Read the whole thing. Lionel White was very prolific. Like I say, wrote like 35 heist novels, and it was solid stuff that just kept me reading. Every chapter ended with a cliffhanger. You had to keep going to find out what happened at the end. He's been adapted into quite a few movies other than The Killing. One of them was one of my favorites, The Night of the Following Day, a kidnap thriller starring Marlon Brando, Richard Boone, and Rita Moreno. If you ever get a chance to check this one out, it's a goodie. It's a good crime film. Okay, if you need to get a hold of me directly, write to me via email. Type with your little fingers. The brunobookstore@gmail.com. brunobookstore@gmail.com, in case you're listening to this rather than watching it, is the surest way to reach me with your questions, suggestions, pictures of your dogs and kitties, critiques, whatever. And that's the place to reach me. I will, I find questions here in the comments below the videos, but Sometimes I miss them. And people send me comments and questions on Facebook, and sometimes I miss them. But if you go to brunobookstore@gmail.com, you will not be ignored. Anyway, while I still have you, if I can get this image to come up, I write a book. I write a bunch of books about Levon Cade, a former Marine. Like I've said before, these novels scratch my Punisher itch. And the 11th novel came out recently. I am going to start the next novel, the 12th novel. I'm going to start writing it next week. It should be out early next year. And these are action-packed shoot-'em-ups, unapologetic crime thrillers. Levon is a vigilante and an outlaw as well. He's always on the run from the law. He's always on the run from authority. But he always manages to run into trouble, which he generally only makes worse by his involvement. So violent, blood-soaked, but there's also a lot of family interest as he does have children. He does have ties to the real world. He, just like Batman, he is not a psychotic loner. He has people that count on him. So you can go on over to Amazon. These things are on Kindle. They're in paperback, and they're also on audio. So I want to thank you all for listening. Thank you all for watching. Thank you for subscribing if you did. Thanks for any super thank yous you might want to lay on me. And I'll see all of you down the road.